10 false myths on the Spanish economy. Myth number 1. Public debt exceeds 363% of the GDP. A recent analysis questions the belief that Spain is the third most highly indebted country in the world and that it will soon fail to meet its payments. The analysis states that this is false and that the total debt of the country is lower than 268% of the GDP. There are a number of reasons why this myth is false, but we will mention only two. On the one hand, wholesale bank debt should not be added to the rest of the country's debt to calculate the total debt for one simple reason. If you owe 100,000 euros to the bank, and the bank owes that money to a wholesale investor, then that debt should not be accounted for twice. On the other hand, the toxic debt related to the real estate sector represents 40% of the GDP in terms of gross value, but only 20% in terms of net value, considering that 50% of it has already been provisioned. Myth number 2. Spanish authorities spend recklessly. Aggregated public expenditure in Spain is the second lowest in the Western world, which means the country's problem is not so much to do with public expenditure, but with public revenue, which is much lower than in many other European countries. Spain will soon become the Western country with the lowest public expenditure, thus making it a very attractive destination for investors. Myth number 3. Spain is not competitive. That is inexact. Unit labor costs in Spain have fallen 4% since 2008, whereas in its three main commercial partners, Germany, France, and Italy, they have increased between 5 to 10%. Myth number 4. Spain does not have a growth model to leave the crisis behind. This statement is false because, for example, Spain's exports have increased 17% since 2008, higher than the 12% of Germany, 5% of France, and 4% of Italy. Myth number 5. The worst is yet to come for Spain. This statement is debatable to say the least because Spain has reduced its current account deficit in more than 10% of the GDP in 5 years, which is certainly remarkable. Furthermore, the country has a trade surplus for the very first time since the introduction of the euro. Myth number 6. Europe will allow Spain to leave the euro. This is highly unlikely because Spain breaking up from the euro could result in Italy also leaving the euro, which could eventually cause the end of the common currency. This in turn would lead to the collapse of German exports, 40% of its GDP, banking statements, with a cost that would certainly exceed that of maintaining the euro. Myth number 7. Spain does not implement reforms. That is false. Spain has undertaken a fiscal adjustment accounting for 11% of the GDP, much higher than the United Kingdom or the United States, as well as other reforms that should have been taken some decades ago. All this will result in an additional GDP growth of 8.6% and the creation of 2 million jobs before the year 2020. Myth number 8. Deposits in Spanish banks are fleeing the country. This is partially false because when the Spanish government in November 2011 limited deposit returns, banks convinced many of their clients to join commercial papers, which have no interest rate limits and are not accounted for as deposits. Once limits were eliminated in August 2012, much of the money was put back in deposits. Myth number 9. The CDS, or credit default swap, of Spain places it as the 5th country most likely to suspend payments. This statement is false and naive because CDS differentials do not show political or social stability. Countries suspend payments when they reach very high public debt levels, above 120% of the GDP, have no access to liquidity, and are incapable of growing. Spain is far from that scenario. Myth number 10. Spaniards don't work hard. This article disproves this myth by showing that Spaniards have long work days, the third longest in developed countries according to the OECD. The article also mentions that although hourly productivity is 10 to 15% lower than the Eurozone average, hourly wages are 35% lower than in the rest of the Eurozone. Thus, low labor cost, High relative productivity and long workdays explain the success of Spanish exports and why foreign direct investments increased 100% between 2011 and 2012.